During the Second World War, Franklin Delano Roosevelt referred to our military as the arsenal of democracy. I have a friend of mine who loves that term for our military. You know, this idea that if we want to be a democratic people and we want to be a sovereign people, we have to have a military force that's able and capable of defending foreign foes and repelling those who come against us and would seek to do us harm. You know, it's an interesting thing in the book of 1 Samuel, we're going to find, you know, Saul is in a circumstance where he's got to decide what size force to have and then how to defend against the Philistines. We pick up in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 1. It says, Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 42 years over Israel. He chose 3,000 men from Israel for himself, and 2,000 were with Saul at Michmash and in Bethel's hill country, and 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah and Benjamin. He sent the rest of the troops away, each to his own tent. Point number one, so far so good. Saul is anointed king, and he has to decide how many men he's going to keep with himself. A small force with him and Jonathan to respond to any threats from outside. And so, you know, at this point, it says here that he's 30 years old. That's a little bit problematic. Samuel goes on in the interpretation of our scriptures. It says that he ruled over Israel for 42 years. There's a question about, you know, whether that is kind of a note that Samuel just wanted to give us about the length of his kingship. But that he had, in this particular incident, he hadn't been ruling that long. More likely, Saul is 40 years old here because of the fact that Jonathan is old enough to be a military commander, and there's a very good chance that that 42 number, that it's 2 years into his reign that this incident takes place. And by the way, we do know that Saul reigned in Israel for over 40 years because the Apostle Paul references it in the book of Acts. And so all of that to say, he keeps 2,000 men with him. He sends 1,000 men to Gilgal to be with Jonathan, and the rest of the men he dispersed, or the rest of the army he had dispersed to their own tents, meaning he allowed them to go home. Continuing in verse 3. Jonathan attacked the Philistine garrison in Gibeah, and the Philistines heard about it. So Saul blew the ram's horn throughout the land, saying, let the Hebrews hear, and let all Israel heard the news. Saul has attacked the Philistine garrison, and Israel is now repulsive to the Philistines. Then the troops were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. The Philistines also gathered to fight against Israel, 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and troops as numerous as the sands of the seashore. They went up and they camped at Michmash, east of Bethaven. The men of Israel saw that they were in trouble because the troops were in a difficult situation. They hid in caves and in thickets, among the rocks and in holes and in cisterns. Some Hebrews even crossed the Jordan to the land of Gad and Gilead. Saul, however, was still in Gilgal, and all of his troops were gripped with fear. Point number 2, things go sideways when Jonathan attacks the Philistine garrison, and it's an interesting thing. So the Philistines hear about it and they mobilize. Saul hears about it and he recognizes that the Philistines aren't just going to sit there and take it. So Saul gets called, sends out, blows the trumpet, and he basically says Israel is now a stench to the Philistines. And so the Philistines start gathering their troops. Israel's troops start gathering together. The numbers of the Philistines were 3,000 chariots. And by the way, chariots were the tanks of their day. 6,000 horsemen and troops as numerous as the sand of the seashore. And they went up and they camped at Michmash. And it's an interesting thing. The men of Israel were basically overwhelmed. And they basically flee and they hide in caves and thickets and rocks and holes and in cisterns. They recognize that they can't stand up to this Philistine force in their current numbers. Pretty heartbreaking circumstance. Those that actually were still at Gilgal with Saul, they were trembling and gripped with fear. Continuing in verse 8. He waited for 7 days for the appointed time for Samuel had set, and Samuel didn't come to Gilgal. The troops were deserting him, so Saul said, bring the burnt offering and the fellowship offerings. Then he offered the burnt offering. Just as he finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel arrived, and Saul went out to greet him, and Samuel asked, "What have you done?" Samuel answered, "When I saw that the troops were deserting me, and you didn't come within the appointed days, the Philistines were gathering at Michmash. I thought, the Philistines will now descend on me at Gilgal, and I haven't sought the Lord's favor, so I forced myself to offer the burnt offering." Samuel said to Saul, "You have been foolish. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. It was at this time that the Lord would have permanently established your reign over Israel. But now your reign will not endure. The Lord has found a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him ruler over his people, because you have not done what the Lord commanded." Then Samuel went from Gilgal to Gibeah in Benjamin. Saul registered the troops who were with him, about 600 men. Point number 3 is Saul offers the sacrifice in an attempt to bolster his troops' morale, but Samuel shows up and rebukes him for his foolishness. So it's fascinating. Saul initially waits 7 days, and his troops are bleeding out, like they're rebelling and they're leaving. And he thinks to himself, "I've got to do something." So he basically takes that opportunity and he offers the sacrifice, which was only just for the priest to offer. And it's heartrending because this was a command from the Lord. Like, Saul knew better. And we have to understand this punishment that Saul's about to receive about his line ending because of the fact, or his kingship ending, because of the fact of the Lord's holiness. We can't just take the revelation that God's given us and just go, "Well, I'm going to interpret it however I want." We have to interpret it in the spirit that the Lord meant it to us. When you come into covenant, there is a more, in every covenant, there is a more guarantor of the covenant, who is the one who has power and influence, and then there's the submissive in the covenant typically. And it's an interesting circumstance. God is the one who is the guarantor of the covenant that he's given to us, and so we have to understand that we have to respond and function in the way that he sees as proper and fit. Saul broke this. And by the way, the priests were the ones that were called to make the sacrifices, and he was not of the proper tribe to function in that role. He was a Benjaminite. It's an interesting thing. Just after he makes, he expected Samuel at a certain time, at the 7th day, he thought he would be there. He didn't make it at that time, but as soon as he makes the transgression and offers the sacrifice, who shows up? Samuel. Samuel calls him out and goes, "You've done a foolish thing." And a fascinating tidbit here, Samuel goes, "This is the time that God would have established your kingship and your lineage forever. But because you have done this foolish thing, that God has raised up a man after his own heart, and basically will set him as king." This was an epic fail. It's interesting. At this point, Samuel takes the men that are with him and he goes to Gilgal. He numbers them. There's about